I for one believe that a Gears of War game set in the Pendulum Wars is a very good idea. And before I share my thoughts on why I think that, let me briefly describe what the Pendulum Wars was. It is a war, not between humans and locusts, but between the COG and a group of people called the UIR. The reason for this war is emulsion, a type of fuel. There are a lot of characters who fought in the Locust War who also fought in the Pendulum Wars, such as Marcus and Dom, and Dom's brother, which I didn't even know he had a brother before I did research for this video. His brother's name is Carlos, and he died in the Pendulum Wars, which is something that could be in the story of this game. And what finally ended the Pendulum Wars was the COG stealing a device called the Hammer of Dawn. I'm sure you know what that is if you played this game. Okay, now that we all know what the Pendulum Wars was, let's establish what makes a Gears of War game a good Gears of War game. I think the main things that make a good Gears of War game are, of course, the cover-based combat, the amazing story, the unique characters and the unique enemies, the incredible soundtrack, and the grim atmosphere. Now, of all of these things, I think the most important thing is probably the gameplay, the third-person cover-based combat. That's why most people really like Gears of War. And when Gears of War first came out in 2006, that's why so many people were drawn to it, because not many games had cover back then, and I think far too little games have cover now even, for that matter. And of course you can't have a Gears of War game without an amazing story, and you can certainly tell an amazing story in a game about the Pendulum Wars. Now, if a Gears of War game about the Pendulum Wars was made, what of that would we lose? We would of course lose the Locust, but they would be replaced by the UIR, which is still a pretty unique enemy. And the Locust aren't just like the Locust drones, but there's also like the Boomers, the Berserkers, the Corpsers, like all those different variations of Locust. But the UIR are kind of just people, which we can still make a good Gears game with just people, I think. We also wouldn't have any of the Locust weapons, but we would, however, have a bunch of new UIR weapons. And instead of having a chainsaw gun, we would have a Retro Lancer, which it just has a blade on the end, if you don't already know. It's not as cool, but it's cool enough. So we would basically just be losing everything related to the Locust, and we would probably be losing a lot of the horror aspect of the game, which, this is a war we're talking about, so there's gonna be plenty of that, I think, just not as much, because you're not fighting monsters. So basically, there'd be less horror, but more war. I think that what could be done for a game about the Pendulum Wars is having larger scale battles than we've ever had in any other Gears of War game. I think that would work perfectly in a game about the Pendulum Wars. I think the best way to go about the story of this game is making the main character be either Marcus or Dom. It would also work to play as a new character, but I think it'd be much better if we played as Marcus or Dom. If we played as Marcus or Dom, we could see the backstory of those two characters. We could see the events leading up to Gears of War 1. We could see why those characters are who they are in that game. And if anything, it'll make the ending for Gears of War 1 even better. If anything, it'll make the entire story for Gears of War 1 better, because we see what happened to get to that point. And we see why Hoffman really doesn't like Marcus. And then at the end of the game, we see Hoffman finally accept Marcus. I could be mistaken, but I think there's comic books about the Pendulum Wars and maybe comic books about their backstory. Again, I could be wrong about that. But regardless, it would be very good to have that backstory in a game. Speaking of story, the story of the newer Gears of War games, they don't really make sense, and I'm talking about in 4 and 5. We're fighting this new enemy called the Swarm, and they just really came from nowhere. It's likely gonna be revealed if they make a new game continuing that story, but here's the thing, I don't really care about that story that much. I don't care if it continues or not. I care more if the series as a whole continues, but that story specifically I really don't care about. What I care more about is a game in the Pendulum Wars, because the story of a game in the Pendulum Wars would actually make sense. So overall, I think we can lose the Locusts, and everything regarding the Locusts. We can lose the chainsaw gun, we can lose the horror aspect of the game, but we will still have most of the things that make a good Gears of War game, and a little more. When and if a new Gears of War game is announced, I'm hoping it's either a remaster of Gears of War 2, or a game about the Pendulum Wars, because if it's Gears of War 6, I really don't care. Goodbye.